Hello, Symposiast. I'm Dr. Angela Puca, Religious Studies PhD and University Lecturer, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. This video is going to be a deep dive into the Temple of Set. I could say a form of Satanism, but perhaps it is not a form of Satanism. It is a bit debated, as I will explain throughout the lecture. And this episode is actually based on a Magus lecture that I gave to my patrons. So you also get a sense of the type of lectures that I give to my patrons. And then afterwards, obviously, we have a discussion amongst ourselves about the topics that I covered. So yeah, if you're interested in the Temple of Set, in Setianism or Satanism, however people pronounce it, I know that people pronounce it in different ways, and how a form of Satanism, if it can be defined so, because I know it is a bit controversial, can address certain theological concepts in a way that is quite distinctive and very different from other forms of mysticism. You'd have that very often forms of mysticism and spirituality would see as the ultimate goal the unification with a perceived whole or a perceived deity, whereas with Satanism or Satanism, you have the opposite, that the mystical goal is actually preserving your identity, your separation. So we will talk about that. We will also talk about their interpretation of Egyptian elements, including the key concept of Xeper, and much, much more. So if you want to learn all about Temple of Set, stay tuned, because this episode is going to be about that. And if you listen up until the end, I want you guys to leave me sun emoji so that I know that you have listened up until the end. And also, I'd like to remind you that this project can only exist thanks to you guys, thanks to your support. So if you have the means and want to support my work, I would really appreciate it if you joined my fantastic and ever-growing Patreon community. You can support me on Ko-fi, PayPal. You can super thank me in the comments, checking out my services and my online courses. I have one on the Left-Hand Path that if you are interested in the Temple of Set will definitely enjoy. So yeah, check out my online courses at drangelapuca.com, as well as my services, and sign up for my newsletter. It is free and you get access to my uncensored thoughts. And lately I've sent an issue about a personal matter that has led people to send me fantastic messages of love and support. So if you're one of those people, do know that I read all of the responses, and I deeply appreciate it. So yeah, without further ado, I'll leave you to the lecture, and let me know in the comments what you thought about it. Don't forget to smash the like button if you like the video, and share the video around. Thank you so much for being here. So today we're gonna talk about the voice of Set, the Temple of Set, and more specifically about the concepts of Xeper and Diabolicon. And the Temple of Set emerges as it did in 1975 from Michael Aquino's rather dramatic rupture from LaVey's Church of Satan. And also it is fascinating how it simultaneously claims and disclaims its satanic heritage and insists that Satan is merely, one culturally specific name for something that transcends its Christian framing entirely. Now, the notion of a left-hand path comes with its own conceptual difficulties because Temple of Set is considered part of the left-hand path. And we shouldn't treat it as some kind of transparent category when it's really, as Granholm has convincingly argued, an analytical convenience with its own peculiar genealogy. I have mentioned a few times what the left-hand path is and what their characteristics are. So just to talk about what Granholm thinks about it, his suggestion that is that we employ it heuristically to identify movements pursuing individuation through mythic inversion. And I think that it seems sensible enough. Though I do wonder whether the very act of categorization sometimes could impose a coherence that might not actually be there. The Temple of Set certainly fits the model of the left-hand path. Yet what strikes me as particularly interesting is how it reconfigures the entire grammar of adversarial symbolism through its appropriation of Set. And here I think we need to tread carefully, because this isn't simply Satanism in Egyptian dress. Van Logic hints at something more fundamental when he observes that post 1975, developments include movement where the adversary becomes a metaphysical principle of individuation. Though I'd venture, that this perhaps understates how radical the shift really is. The distinction matters enormously because without it, Setian discourse looks deceptively familiar, almost tediously so. Both LaVeyan and Setian traditions celebrate autonomy, both make a performance of refusal, and both cultivate the intellectual contrarian's stance. Yet these surface resemblances obscure what I would argue are fundamentally different projects. Petersen captures something essential when he notes how LaVeyan ritual functions as psychodrama, serving an essentially ironic self, whilst Setian practice, and here things become properly interesting, theorizes a ritual as theurgic encounter that supposedly reveals what they call an isolate intelligence. And this isn't just a difference of degree or commitment. It reorganizes the entire conceptual architecture. Where LaVey's project remains fundamentally performative, a kind of cultural transvaluation, if you will, Satanism relocates value creation to what it presents as an ontological process of becoming that treats culture as at best a medium through which this process must be carefully navigated, and at worst, I suspect, as something to be transcended entirely. Take the temple's central concept of Xeper, which they have borrowed from ancient Egyptian, with what one might charitably describe as creative license. The scholarly debates about whether it should be rendered as to become, to manifest, or I have come into being, strike me as rather missing the point. What matters is the doctrinal weight this term carries within Setian discourse. This isn't decorative Egyptomania, though one could be forgiven for thinking so. Xeper functions as a criterion, supposedly indexing verifiable increases in one's capacity for will and understanding, tracked through initiatory recognitions and maintained through disciplined practice. There's something very that is almost touchingly earnest, perhaps even naive, about this attempt to construct what Granholm aptly terms a post-Satanist path, one that transforms protest identity into an inwardly normative curriculum whilst still bearing the marks of its LaVeyan origins and broader countercultural influences. This raises methodological questions that I'm not entirely convinced the existing literature has adequately addressed. Much scholarship on Satanism has wavered, sometimes awkwardly, between taxonomic ambitions and apologetic impulses, between sorting groups into neat categories and demonstrating their essential harmlessness, as if these were the most interesting things about them. Both approaches have merit, certainly, but they risk missing what might be most intellectually provocative about movements like the Temple of Set. How does revelation function in a system that rejects external moral order, whilst affirming objective standards of self-becoming. That is a genuine puzzle. What kind of authority can a self-authorizing scripture like Aquino's Diabolicon claim within a community that prides itself on suspicion of authority? Dyrendal, Lewis, and Petersen suggest that modern Satanism operates as a social technology for authoring identities that are at once adversarial and respectable. And if they're right, then the Temple of Set represents an attempt to push this technology toward what I would call its theurgic limit, domesticating rebellion into something resembling pedagogy. One might reasonably object that I'm overstating the distinction between Setian and LaVeyan approaches, given that both employ ritual for self-fashioning and both locate authority in practitioner competence. Fair enough, I suppose. Petersen's account of self-religion, with its emphasis of on elective belonging and experimental belief, certainly captures something that runs across the field. Yet, Setian texts and the institutional scaffolding supporting them work to ontologize what elsewhere remains strategic or provisional. The adversary isn't simply a catalyst. It becomes, or claims to become, the very ground of personhood. Xeper isn't therapy. It's presented as an ontological claim about human potential, though whether we should take this at face value is another matter entirely. Van Logic's longue durée perspective helps temper any romantic overstatement. Yet it also highlights how unusual such explicit metaphysical commitments are, even within the already rather unusual world of religious Satanism. There are obvious risks in taking these self-presentation too seriously, and scholars are justifiably suspicious of insider philologies that smuggle metaphysics through the back door of Egyptology. Yet purely skeptical exposition misses something important. Satanism offers a remarkably clear example of how adversarial myth can be retooled into disciplined soteriology, though whether it succeeds is another question. Dole White notes a general turn away from sensationalism toward theoretically informed case studies. And it's within this context that Satian doctrine becomes intelligible, not as a curiosity, but as a crystallization of tensions running through modern esotericism more broadly, including that perpetual negotiation between autonomy and tradition, between the desire for authority and the suspicion of it. If we therefore approach Satanism as a modern adversarial repertoire, treat the left-hand path as a heuristic for projects of self-deification, and understand Satanism as a specific Egyptologically inflected instantiation of that heuristic, we gain something like an interpretative framework. Though I'm aware that this sounds rather too neat. The definitional work doesn't eliminate messiness, nor should it. It does, however, make visible an argument internal to the sources themselves, namely that the adversary becomes most potent when it ceases to be primarily reactive. In the Temple of Set, if we are to believe their own account, adversarial myth isn't opposition for opposition's sake. It becomes the grammar of a path that measures itself by the degree to which one has, to use their language, come into being, whatever that might actually mean. Now, let's look at the historical prologue. So the genealogy of contemporary Satanism invariably returns to that peculiar confluence of factors in mid-1960s San Francisco, where Anton LaVey's Church of Satan emerged as something between carnival sideshow and a serious religious experiment. We could suspect that LaVey himself would have appreciated this ambiguity. The scholarly consensus, such as it exists, tends to emphasize the theatrical dimension of LaVey's project, though perhaps we risk overlooking the earnestness that can lurk beneath carefully orchestrated spectacle. After all, the very act of donning a cape and proclaiming oneself high priest of Satan requires a certain commitment and also self-confidence, even if that commitment is primarily to the bit. LaVey's Satanic Bible, the curious amalgam of Ayn Rand, Ragnar Redbeard, and what one might charitably call creative borrowing from various occult sources, codified a philosophy of unapologetic egoism that stripped away metaphysical pretensions in favor of raw self-assertion. Into this milieu arrived Michael Aquino in 1969, a figure whose academic training in political science and military bearing seemed oddly incongruous with the bohemian theatricality of LaVey's circle, though perhaps it was precisely this incongruity that would prove generative. The divergence between LaVey and Aquino appears in retrospect almost overdetermined. Where LaVey deployed Satan as a consciously adopted symbol, a mask worn with knowing irony, Aquino seemed to entertain and would eventually embrace the notion that behind the symbol lay something ontologically substantial, what he would come to identify not with the Christian devil, but with the Egyptian deity Set. This wasn't just a difference in metaphysical taste, it represented fundamentally incompatible approaches to what the left-hand path might actually mean. The 1975 schism has been narrated and re-narrated by partisans on both sides. Though Van Lugic's more dispassionate account from 2016 situates it within patterns of fragmentation that characterize new religious movements more broadly. LaVey's decision to essentially commodify priesthood appointments, allowing financial contributions to substitute for initiatory achievement, struck Aquino as a betrayal of whatever genuine esoteric content the church might have possessed. Whether this was principled objection or convenient casus belli remains somewhat opaque, though Aquino's subsequent ritual reception of the Book of Coming Forth by Night, purportedly a revelation from Set himself, certainly provided a suitable dramatic founding moment for what would become the Temple of Set. The transition from church to temple marks something more significant than organizational reshuffling. Petersen's distinction between a rhetoric of rebellion and a metaphysics of separation captures something essential here, though one wonders if even this formulation doesn't quite grasp the audacity of Aquino's project. LaVey's Satanism, for all its provocations, remained fundamentally parasitic on Christian symbolism, requiring the very framework it claimed to reject. Aquino's Satanism attempted something rather more ambitious, the construction of an entirely alternative cosmology, one that claimed roots predating Christianity altogether. The turn to ancient Egypt, as Xeper notes in his analysis of Egypt's reception in contemporary esotericism, reveals less about actual pre-dynastic religious practice than about the identity work of modern occultists seeking legitimacy through antiquity. Yet there's something almost touching about the earnestness with which the temple embraced its Egyptological turn, as if sufficient scholarly apparatus could transform myth-making into historical recovery. Organizationally, the temple retained certain structural features from its predecessor, though refracted through Aquino's military sensibility and academic pretensions. The grades of initiation, the local pylons, no longer grottos, the emphasis on individual advancement, all of these persisted, but now reframed as stations along an initiatory path towards Xeper, that untranslatable Egyptian term that would become central to Setian theology. Granholm observes that this combination of hierarchical formality with encouragement of personal experimentation places the temple in an interesting liminal space, neither purely bureaucratic nor entirely anarchic. The LaVey-Aquino rupture thus exemplifies a recurring tension within modern Satanism. Whether symbolic inversion represents an end in itself or merely the preliminary gesture towards constructing an alternative ontological order. The Diabolicon, as we shall see, represents Aquino's most sustained attempt to articulate what such an order might entail. The Diabolicon, so now we can go into that more deeply, composed by Aquino in 1970, whilst still nominally within LaVey's orbit, occupies a curious position in the literature of modern Satanism, simultaneously insider document and theological time bomb. The text deliberately archaic register, its self-conscious mimicry of scriptural cadence, announces itself as something more than philosophical treatise or ritual instruction. The stylistic choice enacts what we could see and identify as scripturalization, the process whereby a text is invested with revelatory authority, though we could also question whether such authority can be simply declared or must be slowly accreted through communal use and interpretation. The structure itself, a series of orations delivered by Lucifer, Belial, Leviathan, and Satan, each presenting their statement, suggests something between Paradise Lost and Gnostic revelation, though lacking Milton's poetry and the genuine antiquity of Nag Hammadi. Lucifer's opening address establishes what would become the central station cosmology, creation not as divine beneficence, but as an act of cosmic tyranny, an attempt to freeze becoming into being, to trap consciousness within predetermined forms. The war in heaven becomes not prideful rebellion, but ethical necessity, the refusal of isolate intelligence to accept ontological imprisonment. There's something almost romantic in this vision, though pushed beyond Byron or Blake toward a more radical rejection of cosmic order itself. Aquino's theological innovation here operates on multiple registers simultaneously. The retention of Lucifer's name, whilst evacuating its Christian moral valence, prepares the ground for the later substitution of Set. But more significantly, it recasts the fall not as tragedy, but as the necessary precondition for authentic becoming. The Diabolicon functions as what Petersen terms a mythic constitution, though perhaps mythic manifesto might better capture its declarative force. The sequencing of the testimonies reveals a careful theological architecture that scholars have perhaps underappreciated. Belial's discourse on material sovereignty refuses both Christian flesh hatred and naive materialism, and presents the physical world as neither prison nor paradise, but as the medium through which will achieves form. This anticipates the temple's later magical realism, its insistence that the physical and psychic are not opposed but interpenetrating domains. Leviathan's section, with its invocation of unformed waters and primordial depths, provides the conceptual resources for what would become the Leviathan Working, though whether Aquino fully anticipated these later developments remains unclear. The voice here shifts towards something more impersonal, less anthropomorphic, suggesting forces that precede and exceed individual consciousness whilst remaining available to it. Satan's concluding oration reads less as climax than as a kind of existential coda, and highlights the solitude inherent in choosing to stand outside cosmic consensus. Unlike LaVey Satanism, which treats such positioning as empowering psychological strategy, the Diabolicon presents it as an ontological commitment with genuine metaphysical consequences. The loneliness of the left-hand path isn't incidental but constitutive. It's the price of refusing to dissolve back into undifferentiated unity. Van Logic notes that the text's quasi-biblical style stood out amidst the Church of Satan's generally sardonic literary output. And indeed, retrospectively, it reads as already articulating a metaphysics incompatible with LaVey's atheistic humanism. Granholm goes further, suggesting that Diabolicon contains in embryonic form the entire doctrinal apparatus the temple would later develop. Its theological grammar and conceptual architecture already present, if not yet fully elaborated. But what work does the Diabolicon actually perform? It creates a usable past, a mythic genealogy within which the Satan initiates sense of alienation from consensus reality becomes not pathology but principle. It establishes a series of productive tensions between stasis and becoming, imposed order and self-authored form, collective dissolution and isolate consciousness. That structure subsequent ritual and that structured really the subsequent ritual and philosophical work. Most significantly, perhaps, it adopts a tone of absolute seriousness and refuses the protective irony that characterizes much contemporary Satanism. The earnestness itself constitutes a declaration. The adversary is real, the rebellion actual, the project of liberation urgent and ongoing. Whether one finds this compelling or merely grandiose probably depends on one's tolerance for myth making that refuses to acknowledge itself as such. Though perhaps that refusal is precisely what allows myth to function as myth rather than mere literature. If the Diabolicon provides the Temple of Set with its founding mythology, then the Leviathan Working represents something altogether stranger, an attempt to theorize and practice what might happen to consciousness after death, though not in any conventionally religious sense. The statement of Leviathan within the Diabolicon operates as more than atmospheric poetry. Satan initiates treat it as a kind of encoded instruction manual that articulates the image of the abyss, those unformed waters that somehow both precede and persist beneath all manifestations and structured being. The interpretive move here is peculiar and worth dwelling upon. The primordial ocean isn't simply chaos in Greek sense, some yawning void of disorder, but rather functions as a kind of matrix, a generative medium from which individuated consciousness must draw if it hopes to reconstitute itself after bodily dissolution. Whether this constitutes metaphysics or magical thinking, or whether the distinction even matters within the Satan framework remains deliberately ambiguous. Aquino's own writings on the Leviathan Working, mostly circulated within temple channels rather than published for external consumption, frame the encounter with Leviathan as a confrontation with what he calls the most impersonal dimension of existence. The entity or principle, or whatever we choose to call it, represents the totality of non conscious being, that vast continuity against which the isolate psyche must perpetually assert its difference. Though here we encounter a rather elegant paradox that Satan philosophers like Don Webb have articulated. The very continuity that threatens to dissolve individual consciousness also provides the medium through which consciousness might reform itself. The working, then, isn't about conquering Leviathan or surrendering to it, but achieving something more like what one might call, for lack of better terminology, a reciprocal recognition. The magician approaches this vastness whilst somehow maintaining that crucial sense of I. Though how exactly this is supposed to work in practical terms, even necessarily, it remains opaque. What we know of the actual praxis suggests something less like a single dramatic ritual and more like an extended initiatory process that might span years or decades. Those who have achieved membership in the Order of Leviathan, which functions as a kind of elite recognition within the temple for sustained excellence in what they term magical self development, describe preparations for what Aquino calls remanifestation. Now, this term requires careful unpacking because it's doing significant theological work. Remanifestation designates the post mortem reconstitution of the self as an independent entity, which is to say, not absorption into some impersonal afterlife or dissolution into cosmic consciousness, but the persistence of individual awareness as such. From the insider perspective, and this is crucial, remanifestation isn't guaranteed or automatic. Rather, it represents the culmination of sustained work in strengthening, refining, and somehow isolating the psyche from what they understand as the entropic pool of undifferentiated being. The audacity of this claim shouldn't be understated, even if we're approaching it phenomenologically rather than evaluatively. Academic commentary on this aspect of Satian doctrine remains relatively sparse, and what exists tends to fold it into broader discussions of left-hand path soteriology. Granholm draws productive comparisons with analogous goals in other esoteric traditions, from certain strands of Western occultism's immortality of consciousness to the Jivan Mukti, ideal in particular tantric lineages, whilst noting how Satanism grounds its model in what he calls a deliberately antagonistic cosmology. The distinction matters, where hermetic or philosophical or theosophical systems might frame the adept's posthumous survival as harmonious integration with higher planes of being, the Satian adept prepares for what amounts to a final act of differentiation, a last refusal to merge. So it's the opposite of many of the soteriologies that you find in other religions. Instead of going towards unification, you go towards separation. The symbolism of Leviathan as unformed waters carries interpretive weight that perhaps hasn't been fully appreciated. Christian demonology typically presents Leviathan as a monstrous adversary to be subdued at the eschaton. But in the Diabolicon, Leviathan's speech lacks hostility entirely. It speaks instead of deep currents that neither praise nor curse, currents that preceded any ordering word and will persist after the last form dissolves onto entropy. The initiate's task, then, isn't to slay the dragon in some heroic confrontation, but to know its contours intimately, to navigate without losing selfhood in the process. This positions Leviathan less as enemy and more as what we might call the ultimate initiator, an encounter from which no self emerges unchanged, assuming it emerges at all. The practical dimensions of the working, insofar as they've been documented, reveal intriguing patterns. Flowers' privately circulated Order of Leviathan papers from 1999, which remains difficult to access outside temple circles, apparently contains excerpts from initiates' magical diaries that describe dream incubation exercises designated to induce oceanic imagery. Ritual experiments with sensory deprivation meant to approximate the formless environment, and the use of the Diabolicon's Leviathan passage as both meditative focus and ritual utterance. These practices, whilst varying considerably between individuals, seem to converge on cultivating what one might describe as a stable inner vantage point, something capable of withstanding the disorienting pull of the abyssus. Whether such practices actually achieve their stated goal or simply produce interesting psychological states is naturally beyond empirical verification, though the phenomenological richness of the accounts suggests something more than mere suggestion might be at play. From a religious studies perspective, the Leviathan Working complicates any simple characterization of the left-hand path as purely this worldly in orientation. The ultimate horizon here is explicitly posthumous, yet it rejects both annihilation and absorption with equal vehemence. It imagines, or perhaps we should say, it attempts to actualize a future in which the adept persists as an autogenic entity, achieving this not through divine grace, karmic mechanisms, or cyclical rebirth, but through the deliberate act of self-definition somehow carried across to the threshold of death. In doing so, it reconfigures the very notion of salvation, transforming it from rescue or redemption into something more like the preservation of productive tension, the ever renewed antagonism between self and the totality from which it emerged and to which it refuses to return. Now, if you want to know more about the left-hand path, I do have an online course on the left-hand path on my website, drangelapuca.com. I know that some of you have already taken it, and hopefully you enjoyed it. But yeah, just as a reminder, in case you want to dive deeper into all the left-hand path, philosophical, soteriological, and religious and traditional aspects. So now let's go into Xeper. Having established the cosmological rebellion of the Diabolicon and the eschatological ambitions of the Leviathan Working, we arrive at what might be called the beating heart of Setian practice, Xeper, the untranslatable Egyptian term that attempts to capture the continuous act of self-becoming that supposedly links origin and destiny into a single unbroken motion. The term derives from the ancient Egyptian verb per, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, which Egyptologists typically render as to become, to come into being, or to transform. Though these translations perhaps domesticate something rather more alien to Western thought. In hieroglyphic script, the scarab beetle serves as its determinative, a symbol that in pharaonic religion connoted the sun's daily renewal and by extension the cyclical vitality of creation itself. Aquino's appropriation, however, performs a curious operation. It strips the term of its cyclical connotation whilst retaining only the active volitional element. Xeper in the Setian lexicon isn't a natural process to which one submits, but a magical act, the conscious shaping of one's own essence against what they understand as the inertia of the cosmos. This conceptual maneuver has attracted scholarly attention, with Granholm identifying it as paradigmatic of what he terms the left-hand path's ontological individualism, wherein the adept isn't understood as an emanation of universal spirit, but as an autonomous center of will. In Setian terminology, to Xeper is to isolate and refine the ba, that personal, unique soul, until it's no longer bound to the evolutionary or spiritual currents that supposedly produce and dissolve ordinary beings. Where the Leviathan Working focuses on posthumous continuity, Xeper concerns itself with what we might call the daily discipline of distinction, recognizing the myriad ways in which one's thoughts, desires, and actions are shaped by collective or environmental forces, and then deliberately reshaping them according to a self-authored ideal. The practical difficulty of actually doing it, of course, raises questions about whether Xeper describes an achievable state or functions more as a regulative ideal, always approached but never fully realized. Aquino's expositions, particularly in the Crystal Tablet of Set from 1989, insists that Xeper isn't a state to be attained once and then possessed forever, but rather a verb without perfect tense, a becoming that never quite becomes. The moment it ceases, presumably, the initiate's distinctiveness begins to erode back into the collective patterns from which it emerged. This explains why Setian initiation is described as an open-ended, both theoretically and practically. The temple's degree system, ranging from Setian first to the rather grandiosely titled Ipsissimus sixth, structures itself not as a ladder to some fixed summit, but as a series of recognitions of increasingly self-directed engagement with the principle of Xeper. Though one might recognizably wonder whether the higher degrees represent genuine achievement or simply longevity within the organization. It's precisely here that the three elements we've been examining reveal their interconnection. The Diabolicon supplies the mythic precedent, the primal act of separation from cosmic order first enacted in the rebellion of Lucifer Set. The Leviathan Working maps what we might call the ultimate test, maintaining selfhood when confronted with the most impersonal reality conceivable. Basically, the self isn't just preserved, it's perpetually reconstructed. So that survival beyond death becomes not the endurance of some static essence, but the persistence of a creative act. Though whether this distinction is more than semantic remains an open question. Setian literature doesn't shy away from acknowledging the loneliness implicit in this path. Both Aquino and Webb warn repeatedly that to Xeper is necessarily to estrange oneself from the consensus reality that shapes most human experience. Though they present this not as an unfortunate side effect, but as a necessary condition of the work. Petersen reads this as part of the temple's comprehensive revaluation of values. Isolation transforms from deficit to resource, alienation from pathology to power. In this framework, Xeper operates simultaneously as existential stance and magical methodology, a means of refusing the constellations of collective belonging whilst somehow drawing from that very refusal the energy needed to define one's own becoming. The psychological dynamics at play here are fascinating, even if one remains skeptical about the metaphysical claims. The theological implications are genuinely radical, perhaps more so than Setians themselves always acknowledge. This system displaces any external guarantor of salvation, replacing it with what amounts to a self-referential telos. There's no God to reconcile with, no cosmic cycle to rejoin, no universal consciousness to merge with. There's only the ongoing work of making and remaking the self according to its own evolving standards. In a religious landscape where even many heterodox currents ultimately promise some form of reintegration with a greater whole, the Setian path insists that the whole is precisely what one must never become. Though whether this represents liberation or a kind of cosmological prison of one's own making depends entirely on one's philosophical commitments. From the vantage of religious studies, this arguably constitutes one of the most developed forms of left-hand path soteriology, an ethic in which the highest good is the perpetuation of selfhood, not through clinging to what one is, but through the refusal to stop becoming what one might be. The Setian adept who successfully Xepers is in some sense always dying to their former self and remanifesting in the same gesture. A microcosmic rehearsal of the ultimate remanifestation sought through the Leviathan working. Whether this represents genuine spiritual technology or elaborate self-deception is perhaps less interesting than the fact that a community of practitioners continues to find it compelling enough to structure their lives around its pursuit. Situating the Temple of Set's doctrinal architecture within the broader landscape of left-hand path traditions reveals something rather curious. It manages to be both deeply familiar and genuinely alien, drawing on recognizable esoteric tropes whilst pushing them towards conclusions that many of its supposed allies would find uncomfortable, if not outright objectionable. The trinity of Diabolicon, Leviathan Working, and Xeper certainly echoes themes we can trace through 19th century esoteric individualism, the romantic Satanist celebration of rebellion, and yes, even LaVey's theatrical antinomianism. Though to stop there would be to miss what's most distinctive about Aquino's project, where much of contemporary Satanism has embraced irony as a protective strategy, a way of having one's blasphemous cake whilst eating it too. The temple insists on a kind of metaphysical literalism that feels almost anachronistic in our supposedly disenchanted age. The adversary here isn't a convenient metaphor for human nature or social rebellion. Set functions as what we might call an ontological interlocutor, a genuine presence with which the initiate supposedly engages, though what exactly this means in practical terms remains, I suspect, variable even among practitioners. The comparison with Telema proves particularly illuminating, not least because both systems share certain surface similarities that dissolve upon closer inspection. Crowley's Do What Thou Wilt certainly resonates with Xeper's emphasis on self-authored becoming, yet the underlying cosmologies diverge in ways that matter. Thelemic metaphysics, for all its transgressive posturing, ultimately situates the true will within a divine order. The interplay of know it and had it, that, whilst complex and paradoxical, isn't fundamentally hostile to human aspiration. The Satian cosmos, by contrast, ranges from indifferent to actively antagonistic toward the persistence of isolate consciousness, where Thelema's eschatology, such as it is, tends towards some form of integration with the divine. Even if that integration is understood in highly idiosyncratic terms, Satanism doubles down on separation as not merely means but end. The liberated Satan doesn't merge with anything. They persist in their distinctiveness, apparently forever, which raises all sorts of questions about what exactly they imagine eternity might feel like. Modern tantric traditions, especially those Western interpretations that have proliferated since the 1960s, offer another productive comparison. Though here, too, the differences prove more instructive than the similarities. The leftward of Vama currents within Tantra certainly share with Satanism a valorization of the adept who achieves liberation through mastery rather than renunciation, who engages with rather than flees from the forces of manifestation. The concept of Jivan Mukti, liberation whilst still embodied, might seem to parallel the Satian goal of maintaining consciousness beyond death. Yet, even in the most antinomian tantric lineages, the liberated self is understood as recognizing its fundamental identity with the divine, however that divine is conceived. The Satian refusal to collapse individual consciousness into any larger metaphysical identity, their insistence that the self remains eternally itself and nothing more, marks a boundary that I'm not sure any traditional Eastern system actually crosses, despite frequent claims to the contrary in occult literature. Within contemporary Satanism more broadly, the temple's position has generated what we might charitably call mixed responses. Petersen acknowledges it as perhaps the most systematically theological expression of the left-hand path in the late 20th century, which seems fair enough, though systematic theology isn't necessarily what most Satanists are after. The temple's earnest metaphysics, its apparent belief that Set really exists and that remanifestation is actually possible, sits uneasily alongside the atheistic materialism of LaVeyan orthodoxy or the chaos magical pragmatism of postmodern occultism. This tension reflects a broader fault line running through contemporary esotericism between those who maintain what we might call an operative commitment to their metaphysical claims, treating them as descriptions of reality rather than useful fictions, and those who approach the whole enterprise as an elaborate form of psychodrama or cultural critique. Neither position is inherently superior, but they do tend to talk past each other in predictably frustrating ways. What complicates any attempt to pin down Satian doctrine is the temple's own evolution since Aquino stepped down as high priest in 1996. Successive leaders have elaborated and reinterpreted core concepts without exactly abandoning them, producing what might be called doctrinal drift. Though whether this represents healthy development or gradual dilution depends on one's perspective. But the concept of Xeper, for instance, has spawned various sub-doctrines like remanifestation, which draws explicitly on the Leviathan Working, and runa, a term borrowed from the Germanic magical tradition to indicate the mystery inherent in self-becoming. These additions suggest a willingness to treat even foundational concepts as living ideas subject to ongoing revision, which is either admirably flexible or concerningly unstable, depending on how much one values consistency. From a religious studies perspective, this adaptability matters because it positions the temple less as a frozen schism from LaVeyan Satanism and more as what we might call an experimental theurgy, continuously incorporating and reinterpreting diverse mythic and magical materials within its basic framework. Granholm suggests that this capacity for synthesis, combined with the temple's relatively rigid initiatory structure, has allowed it to maintain a small but remarkably stable membership in a religious marketplace where most satanic and left-hand path groups barely survive their founders. There's something to this, though one might also wonder whether the temple's survival owes as much to its exclusivity as to its doctrinal sophistication. The continued centrality of texts like the Diabolicon and discussions of the Leviathan Working raises also questions about scripture and authority in movements that ostensibly reject dogma. What allows certain texts to function as effectively canonical in communities deeply suspicious of religious orthodoxy? In the Satian case, it seems less about the inherent authority of the texts themselves than about their embeddedness within an initiatory curriculum where meanings are supposedly disclosed progressively. The Diabolicon encountered by a first-degree initiate presumably reads quite differently than the same text approached by someone with decades of practice behind them. Though again, whether this represents genuine gnosis or simply the accumulation of institutional interpretations is really difficult to assess from outside. The text authority becomes cumulative, experimental, experiential, and allegedly personalized, though always within parameters established by the tradition itself. The Temple of Set's synthesis of adversarial mythology, eschatological ambition, and these peculiar notion of perpetual becoming offers something genuinely distinctive in the contemporary religious landscape, even if one remains skeptical about its ultimate claims. It demands comparison not just with other left-hand path movements, but with any tradition that frames liberation primarily as self-authorship rather than reconciliation or surrender. For scholars, it demonstrates the importance of taking seriously the internal logic of new religious movements, rather than simply categorizing them according to their most sensational features. For practitioners, whether they accept its metaphysics or not, it poses a rather stark question. What would it mean to live as if one's selfhood were not merely important, but the only thing worth preserving indefinitely? The answer to that question, I suspect, might be more troubling than the temple's critics or its adherents fully appreciate. Thank you very much for your attention, and these are my references. I look forward to your questions and comments. Today